I want to continue a conversation that we began last week. Two great cataclysms occurred in the Jewish 20th century. Two earth-shaking cataclysms. The Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, and the recreation of the State of Israel. As I said to you last week, if you look at the course of Jewish history, the greatest moment of destruction has to be the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. The Holocaust matches it or exceeds it. And the greatest moment of redemption, of liberation, of saving, of salvation of the Jewish people has to be Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, and the recreation of Israel matches that or exceeds it. The problem is that Yetziat Mitzrayim and Churban Abayit, the exodus from Egypt, destruction of the temple, take place 1,500 years apart. Holocaust and the State of Israel take place in the same generation, the same decade. How a people make sense of that is part of the great question that we face as the generation that follows. These two events are so radical that two new holidays are added to the Jewish calendar, right? So two new holidays are added to the Jewish calendar, and we haven't had a new holiday added to the calendar since Hanukkah, right? So for a good 1,500 years we had a calendar, and suddenly two new holidays, two new moments of commemoration are added to the structure of Jewish time. Now, what's so interesting is that we approach both of these moments with a tremendous amount of emotion and passion and devotion, but not a great deal of imagination. You go to the Holocaust Memorial, you visit the museum, or you sit through the Holocaust service, and you listen to the accounts of survivors, whether they're delivered firsthand or whether you read them, and you see the exhibits, and you shed a tear, and your heart beats, and it's terrible. And the question is, and then what? And how are you a different person after that? Is this just a sort of one-off? You go, you cry, you're done, you go home, you go back to your same life? Or does this change you in some fashion? Do you see the world through different eyes? And if so, what? What changes? How do you see the world differently? What are the lessons of the event? And this is a good Jewish question, because this is what our ancestors asked about each of the events of our history. It wasn't sufficient just to celebrate the liberation from Egypt. Then they arrived at an entire social vision, an entire moral system based on the idea that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Well, the question then is, what difference does it make to say, and you were an inmate at Auschwitz? And then we come to Israel, and it's the same thing. I don't think I would be far off from saying that support for Israel has become a key pillar of American Jewish identity. It's an imperative. Try this sometime. Stand up in a Jewish group and say you don't support Israel anymore. Then run like hell, because they're going to kill you. Because there is this sense of support for Israel is expected of every one of us, and it's uncompromised. And if you even waver, which means maybe they shouldn't be on the West Bank, bam! You're an anti-Semite, a Nazi. That's what you hear from people. So there obviously is a deep passion and emotion, support for Israel. Now, here's where it gets complicated. So you've been to Israel many times. No, just once. When was the last time you were there? When I was 16 years old. Oh, so you support Israel, you just don't want to be there. Okay, you speak Hebrew, obviously. You read Hebrew newspapers. You communicate with Israel in its own language. Oh, no. Here's the language American Jews love. This is great. I read Hebrew, but I don't understand it. I read French. Fromage. Tour Eiffel, right? Right now it's Le Pen and Macron, right? Very face. I mean, what do you mean you read a language you don't understand it? What does that mean? You support Israel? Israel is that important to you that you would destroy another Jew because he or she disagrees with your vision of Israel's politics, but you don't even read its newspapers? Name 3 members of the Israeli cabinet whose name is not Netanyahu. Name the leading singer in Israel on the top 10 list. Name a filmmaker. What do you mean you can't name these things? How do you support Israel if you don't engage in its culture? You don't speak its language. This is America. I mean, this is an American Zionist thing. So what you find out is that these people don't know a lot about Israel at all. They support Israel, but they support the idea of Israel. But the real Israel, in fact, what's really embarrassing is that, you know any Israelis? Yeah, they're not very nice people. Pushy, not so honest, Zohan, I went to Tel Aviv restaurant, I got elbowed in the face by a lady, So you support Israel, but you don't, what does that mean? And the problem is that for me, I can ask these questions because, I'm a rabbi. What happens when your kid asks the question? So your kid comes home from college and says, there was this big Palestinian demonstration, and I wasn't sure where I should be with all of this. And the parent says, well, you have to fight those people. They're hateful. They're anti-Semitic. And the kid says, why? Why? What does Israel mean to me? It sounds a lot like the Pesach story, right? In Pesach, the kid comes to the parent and says, Mazeh lachem. What's all this mean to you? Right? And you're supposed to answer. You got to tell a bincha. You tell your kid in that day. The kid comes to you and says, why are you so upset? Why does this BDS movement bother you so much? Why is a compromise in American support for the Israeli government get you nuts? What does it mean to you? For some reason at that point the conversation stops and the emotion gets laden on even harder, right? Don't ask that question. That's a terrible question to ask. Well, if you can't answer that question, then kiss this generation goodbye. Because these kids don't have the same emotional overlays. Number one, they've never experienced anti-Semitism, so that doesn't work. Number two, they were raised at a time when Israel was already strong. The idea of a vulnerable Israel, much less the idea of a world without Israel, is beyond their imagination. They don't have the same emotional resonances because they don't have the same base of experience. So if you can't answer that question, kiss the generation goodbye. So I suggest that this is a question, like the Holocaust question we talked about last week, that is a critical task, a critical moment for this generation to begin to study and to ask with honesty. And I want you to understand it because I don't want you to leave here and say the rabbi hates Israel. On the contrary, quite the contrary. First of all, I go every summer and I do speak the language and I can tell you who's in the cabinet. I don't like them, but I can tell you who's there. But here's the point. The point is we have to be able to articulate these things if we're going to be rational in our own support for Israel, and if we're going to be able to communicate it both to our children and to our neighbors. And I think this is the failing of the pro-Israel movement. It's always about hasbara, which means propaganda, it's an explanation. You don't get to the core of what this means to me. Plus, it's a wonderful exploration of our own inner life. What does Israel? What does Jewish sovereignty do for me? How has it changed me in the world? These are questions we have to be asking. And we ask them out of love for Israel, not out of resentment for Israel, out of deep love for Israel. So when I want to answer these kind of questions, I like to do a little history. So let's do a little history together. And by the end of the hour or so, we should get closer to an answer. Shall we do that? So here's my first question. You ready? What's the last line of a Passover Seder? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. What's the last line of the Yom Kippur service? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. We said those words for 2,000 years, since the day we left Jerusalem in 70. How come nobody went? How come you end Pesach and you end Yom Kippur, the holiest days of the year, and you say next year in Jerusalem, but nobody went? Not until the mid-19th century did any Jews in any numbers go. They went to visit. Everybody visited Israel. Maimonides visited Israel. Nachmanides visited Israel. Yehuda Halevi visited Israel. People say Rabbi Nachman visited. They'd go, they'd stay a little while, and then they'd leave. Why didn't they go and stay there? Why didn't they settle the land? Now you'll say to me, because Israel was a wasteland and it was a dangerous trip. I got news for you. Poland was no picnic. Why didn't we leave Romania and Poland and go live in Israel? What happened? Here's what happened. Look at the top of the page. Everybody with me? So the temple is destroyed. Before the temple is destroyed, the rabbis of the Mishnah make a declaration. This is before the temple is destroyed. The rabbis say, one should always live in the land of Israel, even in a town most of whose inhabitants are idolaters. Let no one live outside of the land, even in a town most of whose inhabitants are Israelites. For whoever lives in the land of Israel may be considered to have a God, and whoever lives outside the land may be regarded as one who has no God. So it's better to live in a Goyish town in Israel, like Tel Aviv, for example, right? Town full of idolaters, right? It's better to live on the beach in Tel Aviv than it is to live in Beverly Hills where the majority of people are Jewish. The majority of Beverly Hills is Jewish. Not just that, but just Jews. There are a few. Why? Because the ideology, this is pre-destruction. The ideology is God lives in that land, and you need to live in that land. After the destruction of the temple, part of the way of grieving and mourning for the destruction of the temple was to flip that on its head. They took that very idea and they flipped it on its head. Rabbi Zera, who was a fourth generation Amora, so this is 4 generations later, Rabbi Zera evaded his teacher, Rav Yehuda, because he wanted to go up to the land of Israel. So Rav Yehuda is the teacher, Rabbi Zera is the student. Rabbi Zera is living in Babylon and he wants to go to Israel, make Aliyah to Israel. And Rav Yehuda said, you can't go. You can't go. Whoever goes up from Babylon to the land of Israel transgresses a positive commandment. It's against the law to go to Israel. Why? And here is the new ideology that was created post-destruction. There are 3 obscure verses in the Song of Songs. And it starts with the phrase, I make you a promise. I make you a promise. And from these 3 obscure verses in the Song of Songs, the rabbis form 3 promises. 3 promises. 1, that Israel will not go up together as if surrounded by a wall. We will not collectively try to go and retake the land of Israel. 2, we will stay in diaspora and be good kids. God made Israel promise they would not rebel against the nations of the world. We will stay where we are and wait for God to redeem us. And if we obey those 2 commandments, those 2 promises, what did God promise? God promised to make the idolaters promise that they would not oppress Israel too much. Anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than is absolutely necessary, right? Too much. Now, that's the great promise. So what happened to the land of Israel? It ceased to be a place. It ceased to be a place, and it became a dream. A sense of the redemption of the world. When you say L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, you're not talking about a metropolis in the Middle East. You're talking about a state of being in which the world is redeemed. And until that happens, your job is to stay quiet and passive. Because underneath all of this is the traditional notion that only God acts in history. We are just bystanders. We promised not to go to the land of Israel. And God promised to protect us in the diaspora as long as we waited for the moment when it was time to go. But in the mid-19th century, Jewish young people began rebelling against their elders. And they began saying, enough. This is an ideology of weakness, of impotence, of helplessness. And they began to form Zionists. They used the word Zionist as the national movement to recover a Jewish homeland. Zionist cells. And those Zionist cells, these small Zionist group, Chibat Zion and Chovevei Zion, they began to militate, to move from Europe back to Israel. In the middle of the 19th century, small groups began to move back. City of Petach Tikva is founded as an agricultural school, because if you're going to take yeshiva boys and make them into farmers, they're going to need to know which end is the right end of a hoe, right? And they began the process of building. The anthem of that movement is put into poetry by a great Hebrew poet named Naftali Tzvi Imber, in a poem he called Tikvatenu, which you might recognize because the Zionist movement put it to the song of the Moldau, right? Moldau is not a Jewish melody. It sounds Jewish, but it's not. It's a Czech folk song. Die, 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 right? And this is how it goes. Kol od balevav penina nefesh Yehudi omiyah. Ulefate Mizrach Chadima Ayin L'Tzion Sophia. Translation, it's one sentence, by the way. As long as the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, with eyes turned toward the east, looking toward Zion, then our hope, the 2,000-year hope, will not be lost, to be a free people in our land of Zion and Jerusalem. Now, no, it's a very powerful statement. Od lo avda tikvatenu. It actually comes from the book of Ezekiel. In the book of Ezekiel, it was the Haftorah for Shabbos Chol HaMoed Pesach. It's the story of the dry bones. Ezekiel is brought to this valley of dry bones, and God says, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, God, these are the bones of the people Israel. Avda tikvatenu. We have lost our faith that we could ever return. And he tells him to prophesy over the bones so that they might be resurrected. So Naftali Imber takes that line from the prophet and he says, Lo avda tikvatenu. We haven't lost our hope. Now what's the hope? This is so interesting. If you were a religious Jew, what would you say? Yes, Bimhera b'yameinu yavo eleinu im Mashiach ben David. Right? Or as my neighbors over here like to sing, Mashiach, Mashiach, Mashiach. I don't see Mashiach here. The subject of the sentence is Lihiyot Am Chofshi. The Zionist move is to turn the focus of history from God's to us, from God's action in the world to our action in the world. Lihiyot Am Chofshi. To be a free people. Not a holy people. Not a sanctified people, but a free people. Am chofshi be'artseinu, in our own land. This is the anthem of the Zionist movement. But it really gets moving with a man named Theodor Herzl, who has to go down in history as the world's most unlikely Jewish hero. He was born in Budapest in 1860 to a highly assimilated Jewish family. Right? Didn't speak any Hebrew, had a bar mitzvah, but had a deep sense of Jewishness. A deep sense of attachment to the Jewish people. When he's 18 years old, his older sister died of tuberculosis, and the family in their grief leaves Budapest and moves to Vienna just to start again. And he goes to college in Vienna, goes to law school, finishes a law degree, and never practices because he hates law. What he likes to do is write. And he gets a job writing for a newspaper, and he gets a great job writing for a newspaper. He writes cafe reviews. He writes opera reviews. He writes theater reviews. He writes short, light pieces. You know those opening pages of the New Yorker? I don't know how many of you read the New Yorker, but if you read the New Yorker, the first bunch of pages are like around town. You know, interesting things happening in there. That's what he writes. And then he cashes in. And here's how he cashes in. He marries the daughter of a very wealthy family. Little did he know that she's a clinical schizophrenic. The family is so glad to get her off their hands and give her to the husband that they take them on a whirlwind tour of all of the great resorts of Central Europe. All over Central Europe, these places called spas, or Baden, like Baden-Baden and Baden this and Baden that. And in every place they go, Herzl writes a sort of travel log. He reviews the baths, and he reviews the forest, and he reviews the resort, and he reviews the restaurant. And these get sent back to his editors, and they're published, and they become wildly popular. So by the time he returns from his 3-month honeymoon, he's the most popular writer in Vienna. And his editors realize they have a gold mine in this guy, and they make him an offer he can't refuse. We're going to send you to Paris. And you get to be the cultural attaché, a cultural writer in Paris. In other words, we're going to send you to Paris, and we're going to pay you to sit in cafes. And we're going to pay you to go to opera. And we're going to pay you to go to symphonies. and we're going to pay you to enjoy the life of Paris. Now, Herzl wanted this for 3 reasons. 1, Paris. My God, what a great place to be. Number 2, they're going to pay you to be in Paris. And number 3, he gets away from his Meshuggah wife. So he goes to Paris, and he's writing and he gets there in 1895. Now, the problem with getting there in 1895 is there was this big event in 1895, right? Yes, the French lost a war. Imagine that. Does anybody happen to know why the French lost the Franco-Prussian War? That's right, because they're French, right? The great question of history is, can Paris be defended by land? And the answer is, it's never been tried, right? Now, the French lost the war, and the French needed to blame it on somebody, and there turned out to be a young Jewish captain in the French high command by the name of Alfred Dreyfus. And Dreyfus was this poster boy for emancipation. He grew up in Alsace. He was the only Jew ever accepted to the French military academy, to French West Point. He graduates with honors, becomes a captain, an artillery captain, and he has a position in the high command, you know. He's the Colin Powell of the Jews of France, right? See, one of our boys made it. And when the war went sour, they blamed him. And everyone knew it was wrong. It was just a lie. It was bad evidence. The trial is very quickly over. He is condemned. He is marched out to the balcony. There's a great movie about this. He's a Frederick March. He marched out to the balcony, and they rip off his buttons, and they tear off his epaulets, and they break his sword, and they slap him across the face, and they say, I don't know how you say this in French, but traitor. And they send him to Devil's Island. And there's a huge crowd watching this, and the crowd is screaming. What is the crowd screaming? It's not screaming death to the traitor. It's not screaming death to the enemy. It's not screaming death to Dreyfus. The crowd is screaming death to the Jews. And Herzl is in the crowd, and he can't believe it. You see, first of all, that there's anti-Semitism in Vienna where he came from made a lot of sense because Vienna is a very conservative society. But France is the place of liberty, equality, and fraternity, of Rousseau and Montesquieu. How can it be anti-Semitism here? Here, they signed a Declaration of the Rights of Man, declaring that Jews are free men. How can there be such anti-Semitism? Right? And he realizes something at this moment, and it's one of these revelation moments. He realizes that if you can't be free as a Jew in France, you can't be free as a Jew anywhere. And that if you can't, that one day he realizes, and I think he sees this in his dreams, one day Europe will rise up and try to destroy all of its Jews. Right? Because emancipation was a lie. Emancipation said to the Jew, come out wherever you are. Leave the ghetto. Here was the bargain. If you Jews put away your funny clothes, and if you Jews shave your beards, and if you Jews take off those hats off your head, and if you learn our language, stop speaking Yiddish, and if you behave like a proper European, we will accept you. So we did, and they didn't. We did. Herzl is as European as it gets, and yet he knows that they will never accept him. And he sees in his dreams that one day Europe will rise up and destroy. He only made one mistake. In his diaries he wrote that he thought the Holocaust would begin in France, not in Germany. He thought it would begin in France. So what happens if you have a nightmare and you see Auschwitz in your nightmares? He goes back to his hotel, and in a moment of manic energy, he sits down and writes for 3 days, and he writes a book, and it's called The Jewish State. And he goes, and he needs to he has a program, he has an idea in mind. And he goes to the most powerful Jew in Europe, who's Baron Rothschild. And he knocks on the door and hands the butler his card. Now, he's a famous writer. Yeah, this is like, this is Tom Friedman, Bret Stephens comes to your house. You let him in, And Rothschild, send him to my house. Rothschild takes one look at the first line of the book and smacks him across the face and tells him to get lost. This is what Rothschild read. Would you like to come in? We would be glad to have friends. Come on. It's dangerous to stand while a rabbi talks. You could doze off. Come on, please come in. There's plenty of room. We got a lot of nice warm Jews. Please, all right, whatever. This room here. Can you guys smoosh over and make some room? Come on. We got room. Please, come on. Nebuch. Happy is the shul that has more tushis than seats. Come here. Got room over here too. Nice Jews over here. Listen to what Herzl writes. This is just one page of the Jewish state. We are a people. Stop. Why did Rothschild take offense at that? What does Rothschild want to be more than anything else? French. And he thinks of himself as French. He thinks of himself as purely European. He's already been emancipated for 3 generations. He's the richest guy in the country. They lend money to governments to conduct wars, right? They financed Napoleon. He thinks of himself as a fine French gentleman who happens to observe the Jewish faith. And here comes Herzl, and Herzl broadcasts to the world what everyone else knows except Rothschild. Boychik, you think of yourself as French, they don't see you as French. They see you as Jew boy. I can use other words, but that's how they see you. But so let's stop pretending. We're not like them. We are a people. We are a people. We're living among their people. We're observing their laws. We're following their ways. But we are a people. One people. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots. Our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have been living for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled, didn't live here, where Jews had already been experiencing suffering. I mean, we've been persecuted in this land longer than they've been living here. The majority decides who are the strangers. For this, as indeed in every point which arises in relations between nations, is a question of might. I do not surrender any portion of our right when I make this statement. In the world as it is now, and for an indefinite period will probably remain, might precedes right. It's useless to be loyal patriots, for the old prejudices still live in the heart. And he concludes, the nations in whom its Jews live are either covertly or overtly anti-Semitic. So what do we need to do? Get Jews out of Europe. Period. Get them out. Get them out. Put them anywhere you can. He says, I don't need any, I just need a piece of land big enough to settle, 5-6 million people. We'll pay for it. We have the money. We can govern ourselves. Just get out. And by the way, he considered all sorts of places. Palestine, Israel was number 1 because we have historical roots there. But if he couldn't get it, number 2 was Argentina. Why not? Big piece of land, not a lot of people living there. Cows, yes, people, no, right? Third idea, Azerbaijan. Didn't know where it was, but there's a piece of land there, right? Fourth idea, Uganda. Piece of British Africa. Fifth idea, which you will laugh at, but it was considered seriously, Arizona. Arizona. Listen, I think that would have been, imagine taking Southwest Airlines to make Aliyah. You're in the holy city before your peanuts are finished. I mean, if you can put the London Bridge in Lake Havasu, you can put the Western Wall in Tucson. As far as I'm concerned, that would have been a great. Then the only people we'd have to worry about are the Navajo Liberation Organization, and they don't look too threatening to me, right? He didn't catch. He had no history. Here's Theodor Herzl's big mistake. The schmuck didn't know enough Judaism to know that Israel wasn't a real place. He thought it was a real place. He thought you could actually go there. He thought you could take Jews out of Europe and settle them someplace, and you didn't care what you did with them once you got them there. Just get them out of Europe, because we are a powerless people, and our generation, and this policy of collective powerlessness has now reached the end of its course. In the year 70, when we lost the temple and we lost sovereignty in Israel, we adopted a policy of intentional powerlessness. Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great teacher of the Pharisees, the great master of the Mishnahs, called into the presence of the general Vespasian, on the day the temple is destroyed, and he says, I'm going back to Rome. I'll give you anything you want. What do you want? And he asks not for the temple and not for the city and not for the land. He asks for Yavne and its scholars. Rabbi Akiva called him out for it. Said, but you lost your mind? You lost your mind. You can see why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai realized that if we become a people attached to a land, that means that our existence is contingent on our political power, and we'll never have sufficient political power to protect it. Eventually they will destroy us. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, the rabbinic tradition, on purpose made us a landless, powerless people. Because the theory was that as a cork floating on the waves of history, we could survive until God was ready to redeem us. And it worked. It carried us from 70 to 1896. But in 1896, 1895, Theodor Herzl looks into history and says, it ain't working anymore. Because the nations of the world are now ready to gang up and destroy us. We need to return to political power. We need to return to material power. And in this world, as it's organized, the most powerful institution is a country. Right? You can do a lot as the UJA, as the Jewish Federation. You can do a lot as a synagogue, but you can't do anything compared to what a country can do. Right? Valley Bet Shalom can't buy an F-35, even if you gave me the money to get it. But a country can buy F-35s. And with F-35s are these stealth bombers, right? Fighter bomber planes, right. With an F-35, you can do a lot to protect the Jewish people. This idea that we need to return to power reverses the ideology of history that had governed Jewish life from 70 to 1896. And now we return to power. This is Herzl's dream. Jewish power in the world to protect the Jewish body. To protect the Jewish body. This is the first function of the state of Israel when it was first conceived. All right, stop a second. Everybody breathe. He didn't know about America, by the way. He'd never been here. And by the way, had he known about it, he probably wouldn't have changed his mind, because America in that moment wasn't exactly a philo-Semitic place anyway. All right, questions, comments, counter sermons. Yes, please. Why did God, maybe he did. He gave us Herzl. There you go. I mean, Moses was a pretty unlikely hero also, you know.
So God helps those who help themselves.
Oh, you're asking me to tell you what God does? Yes, I know. Michael.
It reminds me that a number of years ago, Rabbi Shulitz had been to Israel, and he came back and told a story that I think is pretty pressing in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
He said, I went to shul, and I was walking home, walking back to where Marco was in shul.
Yeah.
He said he was approached by an Israeli prostitute. He said who spoke absolutely beautiful Hebrew. He said at that point he knew that Israel was like any other nation state.
Right, yeah. Right, except for this, my pop and I, the first time we went to Israel together, so somebody broke into our car, and we had to go down to the police station. And the police station on Hayarkon Street was right in the middle of the red light district. So we had to go down there. And we made an interesting discovery. Here's the difference between Israel and every other country. They don't work on Friday night. Right? They all go home to mama on Friday night. This is what you should be doing. Right? So that's one of that was David Ben-Gurion's idea. David Ben-Gurion's idea is that Israel's purpose is to normalize us, and a normal people has pickpockets and hookers. And having been in Tel Aviv many times, I can tell you we're very normal now. Yes.
A number of years ago, we hosted James Carroll.
Yeah, right.
And when you read his book, Constantine's Sword,
Yeah.
you come to the conclusion that you cannot divorce European anti-Semitism from the role of the Catholic Church.
From Christianity.
Yes.
Right. That was his. James Carroll was a priest, a Catholic priest, and he left the priesthood. He married his wife and became a writer for the Boston Globe. And he wanted to write a book, and he wanted to disprove that thesis. He set out to disprove it. He wanted to show that anti-Semitism is not innately rooted in the Christian faith. And in the course of his research, he changed his mind and discovered that it was. And he wrote a very long but very worthwhile book called Constantine's Sword, where he traces that thesis. And at the end of the book, he's a very religious Catholic. He makes an incredibly powerful statement to his own church, saying, not only do we have to change our thinking and our liturgy, we have to change our scripture. We have to erase certain verses from our Bible because they're full of hate. You can imagine what a powerful sort of faith statement that is, because it's not becoming the people of Christ. It's a remarkable statement. Turn the page. Ready?
From the Muslims one day, perhaps the same.
I hope so. I'm hoping. We can all hope for that, right? Yeah. In 1903, there was a pogrom in the Moldavian town of Kishinev. A young Christian child is found dead, and the bishop of Kishinev whips up the Christians on Easter, claiming that the Jews killed the child to take his blood to make matzah. Turned out later that an abusive uncle had killed the child. The town of Kishinev goes crazy and attacks the Jewish ghetto, murdering and raping. And what made it doubly worse is it's the first pogrom of the 20th century. People really thought that with the 20th century would come an age of science and rationality and reason, and instead you have this vicious, vicious pogrom. There is a Zionist cell in the town of Odessa. It's going to be led by the guy that we're going to read next, the Acharei. But there's a young writer named Chaim Nachman Bialik who belongs to that town. Bialik is a Lithuanian Jew. He was educated in the Volozhin Yeshiva. But he left the Volozhin Yeshiva to join the Zionist movement and began writing in Hebrew. And he joins the Zionist circle, and because he was the youngest guy in the crowd, they sent him to go to Kishinev to report on what happened. And he reports and he writes a poem. It's a very, very long, epic poem called The City of Slaughter. City of Slaughter, Ira Shachat, the city of killing. And it starts out, it sounds just like a medieval dirge about all the terrible things that have happened to the Jewish people. And then it changed. Listen to Bialik, okay? This is a very short snippet from a very long poem in a reasonably mediocre translation. Ready? Arise and go now to the city of slaughter, into its courtyard wind your way, there with your own hand touch, and with the eyes of your head behold on tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the splattered blood and dried brains of the dead. Descend then to the cellars of the town, where the virginal daughters of your folk were fouled, where 7 heathen flung a woman down, the daughter in the presence of her mother, the mother in the presence of her daughter. Before slaughter, during slaughter, after slaughter, touch with thy hand the cushion stained, touch the pillow turned crimson. This is the place where the wild ones of the wood, the beasts of the field with bloody axes in their paws, compelled thy daughters yield, beasted and swiped. This goes on for about 3 pages, describing the murder, the rape, the pillage, the destruction. And then Bialik turns, and he says something else, which makes this one of the unique statements of Jewish modernity. Listen to the next stanza. Note also, do not fail to note, in that dark corner, behind that cask, crouched husbands, bridegrooms, brothers, peering from the cracks, watching the sacred bodies struggling underneath the bestial breath, stifled in filth and swallowing their blood. Watch from the darkness and its mesh, the lecherous rabble portioning for booty their kindred and their flesh. Crushed in their shame, they saw it all. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps each watcher had it in his heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this day. Those who survived this foulness, who from their blood awoke, beheld their life polluted, the light of the world gone out. How did the menfolk bear it? How did they bear this yoke? They crawled forth from their holes, they fled to the house of the Lord, they offered thanks to him, the sweet benedictory word. The Kohanim sallied forth to the rabbi's house, they flitted. Tell me, Rabbi, tell me, is my own wife permitted? Hamuteret lihi, that's the word. The matter ends and nothing more, and all is as it was before. Bialik witnesses the aftermath of this horrible pogrom. But that's not what destroys him. That's not what touches his heart. What touches him? The men watched. The men hid. The men cowered. They didn't rise in defense of their wives, their daughters, their mothers, their sisters. Right? And when it was all over, they made prayers, thank you, God, for saving me. There's this one little halachic problem. A Kohen is not permitted to have relations with a woman who's ever had relations with anyone else. So the halachic problem is, hamuteret lihi. May I have relations with my wife? And his bitter, bitter, bitter ending is, and all is as it was before. Nothing changes. What is Bialik saying? What has happened to us? Exile, galut. The exile of the Jewish people is not just a question of diaspora, of where you live. Exile is a condition of the spirit, a condition of the soul. It is a common human impulse for a man to rise up and defend his wife, to defend his mother, to defend his sister or his daughter. And yet Galut has beaten that impulse out of us. We have so internalized this powerlessness, this ethic. It's no longer a survival strategy, it's become a way of life. And because it's become a way of life, we have lost the elemental impulse to defend those we love. And in losing the elemental impulse to defend those we love, we have lost our masculinity. We have lost our being as human beings, and we have lost any vestige of dignity. Any vestige of dignity. It is a sickness of the human soul that Bialik perceives in Kishinev. And immediately he packs his bags and goes to Israel. Because in Israel, what he's looking for is something very different than Herzl. In Israel, what he's looking for is a return to a normalcy in which a human being recovers normal human impulses and the power to defend ourselves. Because in the power to defend ourselves is a fundamental dignity of human beings. What kind of people watch their loved ones, their women, destroyed and don't stand up to fight back? What the hell is wrong with you people? So what Israel gives us is not just the power, as Herzl imagined, but for Bialik, it's deeper than that. It's a healing of the human spirit. Galut, which means exile, is a condition of the human spirit that we have internalized, and it's become so normal, all as it was before. We don't rebel against it. Zionism is a rebellion against that attitude. It is a healing of the human soul. Now, that you could say, and this is appropriate, you could take that to an extreme. Because to an extreme what happens is you become a worshiper of power. And instead of the other aspects of Jewish being, you take power as the core aspect of Jewish being, and you become a monster. And this is one of the great arguments within the Zionist community. His opposite is Jabotinsky, who worships power. Now, Jabotinsky also understands that it's tied to Jewish ethics. But the question is, if you untie it from Jewish ethics and power becomes a goal on its own, what does that make of your spirit? That's a big issue, serious issue. Serious problem of Israeli personality, of what happens when power becomes too important. But this is the beginning of the Jewish. And of course, for those of you who remember, July 4th, 1976. Right, July 4th, 1976 is the bicentennial of the United States of America, but for Jews, that was the day of the Entebbe raid. Right, the PLO, or the PLF, one of the liberation organizations, hijacks an Air France airliner, flies it to Entebbe, Uganda, sends all the non-Jews off the plane and threatens to blow up the plane with all the Jews. To their credit, the crew stayed on the plane. Right? Ironically, it's Air France, so that goes back to Herzl and Dreyfus. And what happens is, once again, Jews are subjected to the forces of the world. And then all of a sudden, what happens? You know the story. Out of the sky comes Yoni Netanyahu, Benjamin's older brother, and Ehud Barak, Benjamin's predecessor. And they swoop down, take out the bad guys, rescue the crew, rescue the Jews, and fly them back to Israel. Right? Now, that's important, number one, because it fulfills Herzl's dream that we now possess the power to protect our own. But it's, I think, even more important, and the reason why it's a point of pride is because it fulfills Bialik's vision, that you become a different kind of person when you can protect yourself. And the idea that for once in our history, we're now capable of protecting ourselves. We can protect ourselves. Right? And it's a core quality of being, to be able to have the dignity that comes with fulfilling the responsibility to those that I am entrusted to protect. That's Bialik. Now let's take one more step. Asher Tzvi Ginsburg was a genius, a little bit older than Herzl, grew up in Eastern Europe, finished his Talmud studies by the age of 10. He learned everything Jewish by the age of 10. Borrowed the keys to the town library, taught himself 5 European languages, and read everything. Everything. And became a passionate Zionist. Begins writing in a very complicated Hebrew, calls himself Achad Ha'am, which is ironic. Achad Ha'am means one of the people, like one of the guys. He's a ferocious elitist, right? Never trust anyone who says, I'm just one of the guys, right? He sits in the back of the Zionist Congress in 1897, watching Herzl give his speeches. And he's a curmudgeon, grumbly old fart, right? And he says Herzl has it wrong, because the problem of the Jewish people is not to save the body of the Jewish people. The problem is to save the soul. Because he comes from Eastern Europe, he has a whole different take on the Jewish problem. The Jewish problem is not the failure of emancipation, as Herzl thought it was. The Jewish problem is the failure of Jewish culture. Jewish culture has come to a stopping point. We have become corrupt because we have not allowed Jewish culture to breathe. It has become so isolated and so hermetically sealed that it has not had conversation with outside cultures, and it has not dealt with the core issues of real life. A friend of mine has really great relatives in Israel, in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, came and told us once that 5 years ago, the best-selling book in those neighborhoods, in Bnei Brak and in Meir Sharim, was a 400-page book called Kol Bo Al Shlach Monas. Translation: 400 pages meditating on the laws and traditions of sending Humintashen to your neighbors on Purim. Now, if you can write 400 pages on Humintash, you are a corrupt culture. Something is wrong with you, right? And that's what he said. He said, why not spend 400 pages talking about the ethics of healthcare? What are the ethics of the distribution of healthcare? What are the Jewish ethics of war and peace? What are the Jewish ethics of protecting a natural environment? What are the Jewish ethics of income inequality? What are the real issues that face the state? But that's not what they're interested in, you see, because they become so hermetically sealed into their world that all they're worried about is how big is your sukkah. And so he writes this essay. Listen carefully. We normally think of ourselves as a people of the book, and we're proud of that, right? He says, no, you shouldn't be. A people of the book, unlike a normal people, is a slave to the book. It has surrendered its whole soul to the written word. A book ceases to be what it should be, a source of ever new inspiration and moral strength. On the contrary, its function in life is to weaken and finally to crush all spontaneity of action and emotion, till men become wholly dependent on the written word and incapable of responding to any stimulus in nature or human life without its permission and approval. Nor even when the sanction is found is the response simple and natural. Consequently, the people and the book stand still from age to age. Little or nothing changes because the vital impulse to change is lacking on both sides. The people stagnates because heart and mind do not react directly and immediately to external events. The book stagnates because, as a result of this absence of direct reaction, heart and mind do not rise in revolt against the written word, which has ceased to be in harmony with current needs. The greatest works of Jewish culture always took place when we confronted an outside culture. The Bible is about our confrontation with Egyptian, Babylonian, and Canaanite culture. The Talmud is about our confrontation with Greco-Roman culture. Maimonides is about our confrontation with Arabic Aristotelian philosophy. Whenever we confront an outside culture, we blossom. We blossom. But when you seal up Judaism into a bottle and you don't let it talk to the outside world, you end up with something dead. And that's what he says has happened to us. We must revitalize the idea of a national renaissance and use every possible means of strength to strengthen its hold and deepen its roots until it becomes an organic element in the Jewish consciousness and an independent dynamic force. So he actually made Aliyah. He actually moved to Israel. And he worked for the Tel Aviv school system because he was interested in how do you educate children. He founded the Israel Opera. Now you say to me, Israel Opera. He says, yes, Israel Opera. You say, what the heck is a Jewish opera? Is Verdi translated into Hebrew a Jewish opera? Right? A Jewish art museum. In Tel Aviv, there's a very large art museum dedicated to Jewish art. Is Jewish art museum spice boxes and Torah covers? Is Chagall a Jewish artist? Is Lipschitz a Jewish artist? Right? Is Matisse a Jewish artist? That debate is what Acharei wanted. That's exactly what he wanted. Open us up to conversations with outside culture. So if you go to Israel and you turn on the radio, which you have to do, you will hear hip-hop in Hebrew. Is that Jewish music? I didn't ask you if it's good. I just asked you if it's Jewish. You see, that kind of confrontation, that's what he's looking for. Not just that, but the other thing he's looking for is the application of Jewish ethics to the real problems of life. I mean, my teacher, David Hartman, we read this last week. David Hartman used to say, Israel is the greatest put up or shut up demonstration in world history. Why? 2,000 years we walked around telling the non-Jewish world that we were the cultured moral ones and they're barbarians. Of course we could be cultured. We had no power. We were in charge of nothing, right? They did all this stuff, right? Now we have a country. Says Hartman, we have to show them and we have to show our children that a Jewish state actually behaves differently than a non-Jewish state. This, for Acharei, is the source of the cultural renaissance of the Jewish people. And look this wonderful line. It's not only Jews who have to come out of the ghetto, Judaism has to come back too. And what he says to Herzl is, Mr. Herzl, I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish, but if we follow your plan, we will end up with a state where Jews live, but it won't be a Jewish state. A state where Jews live is not a Jewish state. Beverly Hills is a state where Jews live, right? But that's not a Jewish state. A Jewish state assimilates and internalizes and applies the ethics and moral lessons of Jewish history to the dilemmas of politics. You show me that a Jewish state can do warfare differently. I got to tell you, one of the proudest moments I ever had in this building, a couple of years ago for the APAC program, we have this big program with APAC, and they always bring us a great teacher. And one of the teachers one year was Colonel Kemp. Richard Kemp was the commander of British Special Forces in Northern Ireland and in Afghanistan. And when he retired, he became a consultant. And he went to Gaza during the last Gaza war as an observer to see what the Israelis did, right? And he's a skeptical guy. He's a huge guy. I mean, this guy's as big as a building, right? He went and he comes back and he said to, some of you were there, he said to us, I've never seen an army in any country, in any conflict, in any place in the world more careful about civilian casualties than the Israeli army. He said, if my commanders did what Israeli commanders would have done, I fired them. He said, fire them. You don't tell the enemy you're about to hit a building with an artillery shell, but the Israelis would call every cell phone in the building and tell people to get out. He said, no, I mean, this is what Acharei is talking about. Now, you may argue that. You may say the occupation of the West Bank is grossly Jewishly immoral, but that's the argument you have to have. That's the argument, it's a healthy argument. It's a tough argument for people who love Israel, but it's a healthy argument because it represents the moral development of Judaism in the face of sovereignty. That's what Acharei was waiting for. A very different idea than what Herzl had. All right, two more, then we're going to call it. Everybody okay so far? You getting an idea what we're talking about? Good. Here's two radical, what? What'd you say?
No, can you start over? You said we're getting an idea.
Next year, I'll do it next year. All right, two more really quickly. because this, then I'm going to let you figure it out. Chaim Hazaz is a Russian Jew who makes Aliyah in the early 30s, lives on a kibbutz. He's a writer, he's a fiction writer. But he writes a wonderful story called The Sermon. And it's about a little Jew named Yudke. Yudke is a Russian derivative of Yehuda. Yehuda means Jew. Yudke means a little Jew. Because he's the little guy in the kibbutz. And one day he rises up at a kibbutz meeting, which takes a lot of courage to do. And he says, I have something I want to say. And they say, well, hurry up, because the basketball game's on television, right? He says, and this is the whole story is this sermon. He says, I want to state that I'm opposed to Jewish history. He says, I will begin with the fact that we have no history at all. It's a fact, because we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbat, milk our cows and light our ovens on Sabbath, so they made our history for us to suit themselves, and we took it from them. As it came, they forced it on us, whether we like it or not. What's in Jewish history, he says? Oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again without end. That's what's in it, nothing more. After all, it bores you to death. It's just plain dull. Here now, in Palestine, our children love to read, unless they're stupid. I know this for a fact. I've looked into it. Yes, they read historical novels about Goyim, not about Jews. It's no accident. It's simply because Jewish history is dull. It's uninteresting. It has no glory or action, no heroes or conquerors, no rulers or masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their people without a history? I would say, boys, from the day we were driven out of our land, we've been a people without a history. Class dismissed, go out and play football. This is classical Zionism. What is classical Zionism? Right? For a long time in high school in Israel, you learned the Bible, and then you turned the page in your history book, and they skipped from the destruction of the temple in 586 to the first Zionist Congress in 1896. That's Jewish history. Now they skipped everything from 586 BCE to 1896. Why? Because it was this ideology. History, we are not the subjects of Jewish history, we're its objects. And what kind of history is it that's a history of persecution and oppression? That's not a history you want to share with a child. So put it away. We don't want that. This is a very radical Zionism. This is a Zionism which says, I want to completely overturn the whole story of the Jewish people. In fact, let's go a little farther. You'll see what he says, right? I know that there's heroism in the way we stood up to all that oppression and suffering. So you say, wait a minute. Jews were strong. They survived all of that oppression. He says, I know. I take it into account. But it's nothing but the heroism of despair. With no way out, anybody can be a hero. Whether he wants it or not, he must be. There's no credit or honor in that. And here's his worst. Listen to the next one. This is really going to get you mad. In the second place, this heroism, after all, amounts to great weakness. It's worse than weakness. A kind of special talent for corruption and decay. That's how it is. This type of hero sooner or later begins to pride himself on his heroism and brag about it. See what great torments I withstand. See what untold shame and humiliation I suffer. Who can compare with me? See, we don't merely suffer torments. It's more than that. We love them. We love these torments. We love torments for their own sake. We want to be tortured. We're eager. We yearn for it. Now, before you go on, you all know that person, right? You know that person when you ask them, how are you? They tell you. For an hour, they tell you. What body part doesn't hurt? What doctor didn't mistreat them? Where they were disrespected, neglected, overlooked, where they were turned invisible and oblivious. Boy, are they I just got to tell you. And they just, kvetching as an art. Kvetching as a Jewish art form, right? You know that person? And you realize halfway through the conversation that they're enjoying this. They're enjoying reciting to you all of the pain and all of the suffering. They dig it. They're digging it. They're cruising. They're just reciting all of this misery. You don't want to hear any more of it. But they just want to let you know. Right? Because it makes them a hero. Because the worst things are the girl, oh, I must be, I'm a great, look what I've gone through, right? And he says, that's the condition of the Jewish people. My God, you open a prayer book, what do you read? Nebuch, I went to that Hebrew school. How many of you went to that Hebrew school? I can name you every king who ever oppressed the Jewish people. Right? From Haman to Pharaoh to Nebuchadnezzar to Titus to Torquemada and then the entire Nazi administration, Hitler, Heydrich, Herman. That was my Jewish education. History of persecution. So Hazaz through Yudke says, why? That's not the story I want our children to learn. It's time to put that story away. Now, you can argue back to him. And Israel has, by the way, and I can show this to you really quickly. We talked about this last week. The old Yad Vashem was a mural, was two exhibits, one on Jewish suffering in the Holocaust and the other on Gevurah. The new Yad Vashem, the new museum that was opened 10 years ago, recognizes that there are different forms of resistance. That the ghetto mother who shares her ration of bread with her baby, the rabbi who kept teaching bar mitzvah even as the death camps were working, that this is also a form of resistance. Spiritual resistance is also a form of resistance. So this attitude has become tempered. And Israeli kids now do learn the Jewish Middle Ages because they're learning about spiritual resistance as well as physical resistance. But the question of what makes a hero, right? The last Jewish hero, before Herzl, the last hero for Israeli school children is Judah Maccabee, because he's the last badass Jew, right? You go from Judah Maccabee to Theodor Herzl, right? No, and nobody in between. No, because the idea is that a hero is somebody who shapes the conditions of his own existence, and when we lost the power to shape the conditions of our existence, we lost our history. So that a return to Zionism, a return to Israel, isn't just a return to a land. It's a return to history in a very real way. It's a different sensibility about who and what we are. You saw this. I've seen this. A couple of years ago, without commenting on the politics of this, that the Israeli prime minister comes and gives an address to Congress, which is, in some ways an affront to the president. That's what this is. We will not be put in the position of being an object of somebody else's history anymore. We are going to be the subject. We will guide and mold our own destiny. We will guide and mold our own destiny, right? We don't want to be at someone else's behest. It's a very Israeli way of looking at Judaism, right? It's a very Israeli way of looking at Judaism. So here's his end. Listen to the last paragraph. It's very radical, but it's very true in some ways, right? To my mind, if I'm right, Zionism and Judaism are not at all the same, but two things quite different from each other, and maybe even two things directly opposite each other. At any rate, far from the same. When a man can no longer be a Jew, he becomes a Zionist. Zionism begins with the wreckage of Judaism, from the point where the strength of the people fails. That's a fact. Nobody has yet begun to understand Zionism. This is true. It is far deeper, far more pregnant with vast and fatal consequences than appears on the surface or than people say. When a person can't be a Jew anymore, he becomes a Zionist. So for Hazaz and for a whole class of Zionist thinkers, Zionism is not a continuation of Judaism, it's a break. It is a radical revolution from Jewish history, right? Again, my teacher David Hartman said, it's just like the kid who says to his parents, I hate you, I don't want to be with you anymore, goes out of the house, slams the door, crosses the street, and moves in with his grandmother. Because you rebelled against Judaism, but where did you go to do it? To the homeland. And you rebelled against Judaism, so you decided to stop speaking Yiddish, which is the language of Jewish persecution, and instead you speak Hebrew, which is the language of Jewish liberation. You stopped reading the Talmud, and you started reading the Bible. You stopped celebrating Yom Kippur, but you religiously keep Hanukkah. I mean, you understand what they did. It's a break from what was, but it's a return to what was at the same time. That's a remarkable statement. All right, one last one. Can we do one last one? Yeah. I know you want to go daven, but I want to do one. Yehuda Amichai is a German Jew who makes Aliyah to Israel in 1933 and lives in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem and writes beautiful poetry in simple language. Right? When I was in college, I read T.S. Eliot. I still can't tell you who he is. I did Verves. Right? You know, but Amichai stuff is it's like you can dig it. It's all over Israel. I mean, everyone speaks Amichai because his images are beautiful and his language is beautiful. And ladies and gentlemen, he wrote this poem for us. This is about us. And if you ever come with me on a trip to Israel, some of you have, I will make you memorize this poem. We recite it every morning as Shacharis. I do. I made you memorize this poem. I did, right? Visits of condolence is all we get from them. You're not laughing. You Jews, you American Jews, you come to Israel to sit Shiva. You think all of Israel is one giant house of Shiva, right? Visits of condolence is all we get from them. They squat at the Holocaust Memorial. They put on grave faces at the Wailing Wall. And they laugh, but behind heavy curtains in their hotels. They have their pictures taken with our famous dead. At Rachel's tomb, at Herzl's tomb, and Ammunition Hill. That's the 67 War Memorial. They weep over our sweet boys. They lust over our tough girls. And they hang up their underwear to dry quickly in cool blue bathrooms. Great. Once, I sat on the steps by a gate at David's Tower. That's in the old city of Jerusalem. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Well, just right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period. Just right of his head. But he's moving. He's moving. I said to myself, redemption will only come if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who's brought fruit and vegetables for his family. Don't turn this yet. What is Israel for Amichai? For us, he says, for you visitors from Chutz La'aretz, all you come to look at is ruins. Graves and ruins. That's all you know. You go to Yad Vashem, you go to a Wailing Wall, you go to war memorials, you put your eyes down, and the only time you're allowed to smile is when you close your hotel door. And then your guide takes you and he shows you ruins. Remember the kid who goes to Israel? And they say to him, what do you see? What do you see? He said, what is Israel? He says, one big Herodian ruin. Wherever you go is a ruin. That used to be this, that used to be that was destroyed. What does Amichai say? Don't look at the ruins. What makes Israel remarkable? Life. And what's the life? Normal life. A Jew who can live, that's number one. Not die, but live. Jewish life, not Jewish death, is what makes Israel remarkable. That's number one. And number two, a Jew who can live normal life. Not a historical life, not a philosophical life, not a life of earth-shaking spiritual significance, but Shabbos shopping. A normal life. That Jews don't have to be historically significant, historically cataclysmic. The great revolution of Zionism was to make it possible for normal Jewish life to be conducted. Says Amichai, that's the miracle. Not the ruin. The guy who buys fruits and vegetables Friday afternoon for his family. Myra.
The whole story is that from all the fetching and all the obstacles, they have turned those obstacles into opportunities.
Yeah, it's more than opportunities. It's a refusal to see. It's a refusal to see destruction and death as the category in which you read Jewish history. So what we have here now are 6 different visions of what Israel's for. The Herzl's vision about saving the body of the Jewish people, the Bialik vision about saving its spirit, its dignity, the Acharei vision of reviving the culture of the people Israel. Right? His student, by the way, was Eliezer ben Yehuda, who created the Hebrew language. Right? the Chaim Hazaz's idea that it's time to tell our story differently, that Israel's given us the opportunity to read the history of our people in a completely different way. And finally, the Amichai idea that maybe you don't need a purpose. Maybe the purpose of Israel is not to have an earth-shaking historic purpose, but just to give Jews the one opportunity that history has denied them for the last 2 Yot am chovshi be'artzenu, to live a common, normal, plain, ordinary, meaningless, purposeless, everyday life. And that in itself is the miracle of the gift of the state of Israel. That's the question our generation has to come and answer. Okay? Next week we'll come back to Torah. Take good care.